And here we are. We're all live, and we've got a whole bunch of people to talk to. Priced out, it's Dave and Dujanovic overtime, and we want to continue the conversation. Sometimes we hit a topic that is so important, so exciting, that we just don't want to do it in 8 to 10 minutes. We want to spend some time to really dive into it. So we're going to talk about paying your rent.
Yeah, there's a rental assistance program that's available for Utah residents to apply for. And we had so many questions about how to apply, how much people are eligible for, what you need to present in terms of paperwork in order to qualify, that we thought it would be very important to do a Facebook Live. So you can post your questions in the comments. We'll make sure we get those questions asked of Paul Smith with the Utah Apartment Association, and also Christina Oliver, who's with the Department of Workforce Services. Christina is the Division Director of Housing and Community Development. Christina, you're kind of overseeing this program for the state, and it seems as though there's been a lot of money already given out, but there's a lot more available, right?
That's true. We have well over $100 million left that we are working on feverishly to get out to the community every day.
Christina, it feels like when you say $100 million, it sounds too good to be true. What can you do with that $100 million, and can people really access it?
Yeah, absolutely. It is for rent and utilities. You can even pay for past due rent. So if you have perhaps 6 months of overdue rent that you just can't catch up on, we encourage you to apply on rentrelief.utah.gov. There are some income restrictions, of course. It's not just free to everyone in the community, but if your household is 80% or below the area median income, then chances are this is a program that you could benefit from.
Paul, why don't you start by walking us through what people need to do in order to apply? You're with the Apartment Association. Can tenants apply, or does this have to run through landlords?
You know, the state set it up so that you can apply either as a tenant or your landlord can help you. And I think about a third of the funds have come from landlords applying on behalf of tenants, and 2/3 have come from tenants applying directly. The first step is to identify if you qualify on the income restrictions. And what that means is if you made 80% or less of the annual median income in your county for the number of people in your household. And for instance, for Salt Lake County, I think it's 49,000 for one person, 53,000 for two people, 57,000 for three people, and on and on. There's a great table you can just search, or you can call the state and they can help you. So once you've identified that you qualify, then you have to fill out an application, submit a copy of your lease, get a ledger and a W-9 from the landlord, and then the state is doing a great job approving those pretty quickly.
When people apply, how long does it typically take for the paperwork to go through? And if they're talking to their landlords and they're saying, "Hey, listen, check's in the mail," what does that look like?
Well, in a perfect world, it would happen quickly. Sometimes if the application is 100% complete, it happens quickly. I think right now, Christina can tell us more, but I think it's averaging 2 or 3 weeks. But here's the thing, when the landlord applies, they kind of know the system and they know that they've had others approved. And if the tenant qualifies, they know that the state's good for it. And it might take a week or two, but it'll eventually get there. What do you want to add, Christina?
Paul, you are just right on the dollar. We are processing every few weeks. The problem that we have faced is not getting enough information. As Paul mentioned, working with the landlord is key to this entire process. Our biggest hangup is getting the landlord information. And sometimes landlords are just not aware of the program or uncomfortable submitting their information to their tenants. They can submit it straight through to the state and they can apply on the tenant's behalf. So there are multiple ways to access the funds, but working with your landlord is key to the entire process. Again, also completing the application with as much information as you can from the start.
I want to mention that our listeners right here on Facebook Live, please feel free to post your questions in the comments section. And in a few moments, we'll get to those questions and ask our two experts, Paul Smith of the Utah Apartment Association and also Christina Oliver of the Department of Workforce Services, to help answer your questions. Let's say that my landlord has decided to sell his house, Christina, and suddenly I find myself without an apartment. Can I still qualify for rental assistance through the state, even though I haven't found a place to live yet?
Yes, you can. You can work with the landlord for your prospective new place of residence, and we can work with you on security deposits as well as forthcoming rent.
And how long would you cover? How long would these rental assistance cover me for? Is it just a couple of months, or is it a lot longer?
So the federal guidelines cap the program at 18 months. So that is the maximum number of months that you're able to get any sort of rent assistance. Previously in our conversations earlier, we talked about the reapplication process. If you have a month-to-month lease, unfortunately, you do have to apply every single month. It is a little bit of a paperwork, but unfortunately, that's the way the system is set up. Otherwise, it's typically every 3 months, we'll ask you to reapply. That's based on Treasury's guidelines as well. So we do have some barriers regarding, we can't just provide 12 months of assistance. There are some paperwork things that folks need to do.
What is the limit, or how much can you cover? Because obviously, depending on the size of the house, the rental property, it can go from several $100s to several $1,000s. So can you give us a little guidance there? Like, how much will this cover?
We do not have income guidelines. Treasury has been very gracious in that regard. So we aren't taking applications and deciding whether or not the amount of rent is suitable for the household. That's not part of the program.
So
if
Dave,
you have a large house, multi-family dwelling, so to speak, or several families living very large, sometimes those can be several $1,000s a month in rent. They're taking into consideration that, not just the small apartments, is what I'm hearing.
What you're hearing, Dave, is they don't even look at the amount of the rent. They look at whether the renter qualifies.
And then, Paul, since you work with landlords and probably tenants through the association, how does this money, what's the trail of money? Does it, if I'm a tenant, does it end up in my account and then I need to turn it over to the landlord, or does it go directly to the landlord?
That's a great question, Deb. It goes directly to the landlord. And this program has just been an amazing program for two reasons. Number one, it's intended as stimulus for Utah's economy. Even people that could pay the rent, if they qualify for the money, the state will pay the landlord directly, and then they can save money for a home or pay off their car payment or stimulate the economy going out to dinner and buying kayaks or whatever. And the second way is that evictions are down in the last 2 years by 40%. That tells us that the low income families that normally were not able to keep in their rental housing have been able to stay in their rental housing because of this program. So it's been an incredible success, and the state's just done a terrific job administering it.
You said sometimes the hang up will be not enough information, paperwork. If I'm trying to gather up that information, what are some of the key documentation that I need to start finding?
The first thing I would say is talk with your landlord and get the W-9 information so that we can send the check to the landlord. The other piece of information that you need to gather is your entire lease, if you have one. If you don't have a lease, whomever you're renting from can provide documentation of deposits. If you've been paying, say you're renting a room in a house and you're paying the owner of the house $500 a month for your rent, you need to be able to document in some form or fashion how that rent is being, or how much of that rent is being paid and the frequency. The other things that you'll want to gather are your tax documents, should you have them for the year 2020 or 2021, if you've prepared them already. Check stubs, bank statements, anything that you can provide that will show what your income is, and then we'll project it out.
And Christina, that is information you can upload to that website. And what is the website again?
rentrelief.utah.gov. That is you'll be able to log in, you'll create a Utah ID, and then you'll be able to see where your application is in the status.
One of the things I just learned this morning, and this is as shocking as anything we've talked about. Last week, my daughter and I, she's graduating. She's going to be going to college soon. And I started thinking, holy cow, $500 a month may sound great for a lot of people, but for a broke college kid, $500 is a lot of money to be able to go to college. So I wanted to ask you guys a little bit about college students. Do you have to have gone to college for a certain amount of time, or do the same rules apply? What does it work, or what does it look like for college kids?
Dave, what I would tell you is that since our interview this morning when we talked a little bit about that, I've had some emails on this issue, and some people are saying, how do we calculate the income, and do we apply as a household of students, or do we apply individually? And it all depends on the lease. So if a student has just one lease just for them, then the state will look at their income and their income alone as a household of one. And if they qualify, the state will pay their rent. Now, if it's multiple college students on the same lease, the state will look at everyone's income, and it's likely that 3 or 4 college kids still make less than the 60,000 or so that is the 80%. And so that is how it works. If it's one person per lease, it's evaluated based on that person's income. If it's multiple people on a lease, it's evaluated based on all incomes.
In fact, Jason on our Facebook Live posted in the comments, can you please explain the income requirements for full-time students? Paul, maybe you've already touched on that. Christina, would you like to expand on that?
Yeah, as it is a program that's for the broad spectrum of the community, but it does need to be that you have been financially impacted in some form or fashion during the pandemic. So simply just utilizing it as a subsidy to pay for rent in lieu of, say, student loans, that would be stretching it to a limit that perhaps Treasury hasn't guided this program for. It is for folks who have been experiencing financial trouble, if you will, during the pandemic, not directly related to the pandemic in all cases, but during the pandemic. So that case, we ask the applicants to make on their own. Of course, we don't have stringent criteria, but that really is the source of the funding.
So, for example, then if somebody lost their job maybe a year ago because of the pandemic, but they find themselves underemployed, or they got a new job and they're working their way up the ladder so they can afford rent. I mean, rents are $1,200 a month now for even a 1-bedroom. Do you suggest they apply and then let you all decide whether they qualify or not?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We have so many scenarios of individuals who are, as Paul said earlier on our phone call, they're prioritizing rent because they do want to keep their house, of course. But they're putting everything else on credit cards. So they're digging themselves further and further into the hole. They're putting all of their medical expenses, their food, and that is not a positive thing. This program was meant to offset. So if you have, perhaps you're underemployed or you're just gaining traction and you're still under that 80% household income limit, please apply. You are the reason why this program is here. It's, again, you don't have to pay it back. It's for all members of the population, and we really hope that those individuals take a chance. It's not exactly the quickest process, as Paul has stated. We're receiving over 1,000 applications a week, so we have a pretty big workload, but it will be processed, and we do want those who need it and who can utilize it to tap into it.
And
Does
Deb,
the
let me just
program
add.
end? Sorry, Paul, go ahead.
I was just going to add things like you were sick with COVID and you missed work for a period of time. Things like a family member was sick and you missed work. Things like you had to stay home because your children couldn't go to school or they were doing online school and you had to help them. All of those things are factors that make you qualify for this money.
Okay. Good to know.
How long is it? Does it basically go for a certain amount of time, or is it once the money runs out, the program is over? What's the end date, maybe?
The end date, we have specified timelines in Treasury's guidance. So 2025, the latest, but we anticipate the funds will be depleted well before that time frame. So the funds are available as long as they're available. Sometimes, some weeks we have greater need and requests, and some weeks we have fewer. So it really just depends.
Let's say somebody just found out about this program and they've been scraping by for the last couple of months in a dire situation, and they're watching this Facebook Live and they're like, oh my goodness, I didn't know this money was out there. Christina, can it be retroactive to help people dig back out of that credit card debt as they try to keep their rent in, on time, but maybe putting other things on the credit card?
Unfortunately, no. The rent payments that we will pay for are missed payments. But if you've been making the payments and putting things on credit cards, again, tap into the program now and hopefully try and dig yourself out of the hole in that way.
Okay.
How many people theoretically, you say you're getting 1,000 applications. Is that the limit? Is that a good number of applications, or do you have the capacity or bandwidth to receive many more?
It's a sufficient number of applications. It is a lot to process. Thankfully, Department of Workforce Services has a flexible work base. We have eligibility workers who process everything from food stamps to unemployment insurance. So we're able to scale back and scale up as needed to process these applications. There's always going to be that training delay, but we have been making leaps and bounds progress on training folks so that when we need them, we just tap them in. A lot of our workforce is in rural Utah throughout the state and teleworking. So we're just, we're flexible, we're nimble, and we're pushing through these applications as quickly as possible. Again, getting the correct paperwork is truly what I would just stress over and over again. The quicker we can get complete applications, the quicker we can process these applications.
If you're just jumping on with us, I'm sorry, Paul, I just want to remind our listeners, please put your comments, put your questions in the comments. If you're just jumping on with us, we're talking about a rental relief program. We focused on it today on the David Dujanovic Show on KSL News Radio for a good 20-25 minutes of the show. Felt like you guys would have a lot of questions for these two experts on this program to find out who qualifies, how long you can qualify for. You found out you don't have to pay it back. Please leave your comments. And then, Paul, go ahead and continue that thought. And then let's get to our questions from our Facebook Live viewers.
The only thing I was going to add is that compared to most states where processing has taken months and landlords are incredibly frustrated, occasionally when someone says, I'm frustrated. It's taking me a week or two. I say, well, Utah's doing this better than anybody in the whole country. Be a little bit patient. Understand that for federal programs, like when the federal government sends us $200 million, there are some rules we have to follow. There is some verification we have to do. It's not an incredibly difficult process, but be a little bit patient because other states are taking, in some cases, months or longer, and it's much more difficult. So thanks, Christina, and your department for doing such a great job.
What do you do if the landlord is hesitant to dive into it? Maybe just doesn't want to handle the headache of managing, this part of the business. What do you do if your landlord is just doesn't want to dive in there for you?
Well, if they're members of the apartment association, we have partnered with Paul Smith's group and are extremely grateful. That has been probably the single greatest partnership that we have had in processing these landlord applications. If you're a tenant and your landlord is not trusting of the process, we understand that. We will work and contact the landlord and speak with them, send them the email link so they don't have to give their W-9 information directly to the tenant. They can give it to the state. We have a very secure system. Sometimes that's the reason that there is some distrust or just not wanting to submit their information. Yeah.
Well, what they're asked to do, just to put in context, is to put their social security number sometimes in a document and give it to their tenants. And you can understand why they're uncomfortable with that. And so you can just give that information directly to the state. And as far as the rest, Dave, here's our alternatives. Evict somebody, which is a lose-lose for both sides, or work with this tremendous program with a state government that is the best in the country at administrating this fund and at making the barriers very small and the loopholes, or the hurdles we have to jump through are really reasonable. So again, what I would tell a landlord that's struggling is take a deep breath. It's much better to get some money than no money. And this program pays late fees. So if it does make the rent late that takes a couple weeks to process, no problem. The state will pay that. You'll be made whole.
I think it's really important we start ticking through now these questions. Really, I know a lot of people on their lunch hour watching this probably need to get back to work. So let's get with Jason's question first. 4 girls in an apartment and all incomes have to be combined and below the 80%, or does each girl need to be under the 80%? Christina, I think you addressed this already, but just hit on that one more time for those just tuning in.
Yes, it's the household. So if there are 4 individuals, related or not, they are all in part of the household and their income combined would be counted toward the application limit.
Okay. Dave, why don't you tackle that
the
one?
The rentrelief.utah.gov website, this is from Michael and Parker Sampson. The website cites that the rent hardship needs to have happened because of COVID, but COVID wasn't mentioned at all by the guests on the show. Does the rent hardship need to be because of COVID? Is just I ran a COVID hardship?
So there are 2 different Treasury guidelines. The first tranche of money that we received, you had to have been affected financially because of COVID. So as Paul was mentioning, staying at home because your children needed to be homeschooled, missing work shifts or being furloughed. The second pot of money, which is what we're working on now, you need to be financially impacted during the pandemic, not necessarily directly because of COVID. So we have 2 different pots of money. Depending on your answer to the application question is where we will charge the rent payments to. And so that helps us track it for the feds.
Christina, thank you. And Michael, thank you so much for your question there. Diane Mayberry, does the money you have in a savings count toward your income? That's an interesting question, Paul. Why don't you tackle that?
Well, my understanding is no. Income is income. So if you have saved your hard-earned money and COVID affected you, and so all of a sudden you now make less than the 80% because of a COVID-related reason, that's what this program was designed to do, is to bridge the gap between your temporary reduction in income. It's not, after you deplete all your savings. It's if you were hurt and affected during this pandemic, the federal government's going to bridge that gap.
So they're not looking at doing a deep dive and audit into your assets and how much money you have and whether or not you could borrow against a 401k. They're looking at this year's income and seeing whether you hit that threshold.
That's correct. Yes. It's different from a lot of the other programs that the Department of Workforce Services runs. We don't do that same income asset test for this particular program.
Samantha Nichols asks, what if you aren't renting yet? I think this is a great question because of a number of reasons. I mean, there's all kinds of different scenarios, but why don't you tackle that one, Christina, for us?
Sure. We do require a lease, a signed lease. So if you're working with a landlord prospectively to get into his or her location, you can contact us, you can apply, but we will end up having to have a signed lease at the end of the process in order for us to assist you.
And I think that kind of goes along with what Samantha was saying is I'm having a trouble finding someone that will lease to me because rents are so high. And I think that kind of speaks to that. The fact is you really can't dive into this process until you have that lease in hand.
You need sorry, go ahead, Paul.
I was going to say, I know of lots of cases where someone is looking for an apartment and they go to a landlord and they say, look, I'm working with rental assistance and they'll be able to cover, because I qualify and meet the program guidelines, they'll be able to cover my deposit. They'll be able to pay 3 months rent up front. And many, many landlords would love that. So you're just not asking the right question if you're having that struggle, or, I think there's plenty of landlords that would be happy to work with you in that situation.
But that's a great tip, Paul, that hopefully Samantha is able to take now and run with that. And you're making those calls with those contacts, landlords. It sounds like they're willing to work hand in glove with tenants, because having been a former landlord, it would have been a great relief to me to know that you're going to cover the deposit, or the fund is going to cover the deposit and the first 3 months rent.
Yeah, it's a great benefit. I think if you take it to your landlord in those terms, they'll say, where do I sign?
Michael and Parker Sampson says, do you need to be behind in rent to qualify?
Nope, you do not. So you can apply. Like I said, if you are making 80% or below the area median income and you're putting your food, your car, your medical, everything else on credit cards just to make your rent, you are the target audience for this funding. So please apply. You do not need to be behind.
Jenny asks, where can I look online to find median income limits in my area? Paul, I think you addressed this today during the David Dujanovic show. Why don't you go ahead and run with that for us?
Well, we have a link to it on the Apartment Association website. We have a tab that says resources, then under resources, COVID-19. And then there's a whole section on rental assistance. And I think in the second or third paragraph, there's a link to it's actually a HUD website that you can search what 80% of the annual median income is for your county for the number of people in your household.
I still wonder if there's some ambiguity, and this is from Stephanie Ashcraft. She says, what if you're making less than $30,000 but can't prove it's COVID related as far as the hardship goes? Is there a list that can kind of help people understand, okay, was this COVID related?
Well, it's self-attestation. So if the person says, my income has been negatively impacted because of COVID, for the first, as I said, there's the two pieces, right? Because of COVID or during the pandemic, that is up to the individual to make that attestation. And we do require them to check a box that says it's because of X.
But David, if I can just add, sorry, Deb.
No, you go ahead, Paul.
I was just going to say, I don't know practically anyone who wasn't affected by COVID in some way. Their expenses went up. Their income went down. They had to take time off to deal with somebody sick or to deal with children out of school. And so the state, if you can just articulate a reason like that, they say you qualify. I, for instance, know a couple that was married at the very beginning of COVID, and they said, well, our income has stayed the same, but, we were able to say, no, wait a second, have any of your expenses gone up? And they said, oh yeah, because my mother lost her job and I lost insurance. I had to go buy my own health insurance. That's an example of how COVID increased your expenses, reduced your income, or some other way. So it's a lot broader than just on the surface.
Like it's more, it goes beyond, hey, I got sick with COVID and I had to take 2 weeks off of work. Some of it was paid, some of it wasn't. You have to, it sounds like, kind of just think about it a little deeper and out of the box. So I think of people that I know who had jobs that were a direct correlation to COVID. For example, there was a lot of company and industry testing that was going on that eventually stopped. And a lot of those contract workers lost their jobs because of it, or a lot of businesses shut down. Restaurants went, mainly remote, and they were delivering curbside. So a lot of restaurant employees lost their jobs and maybe haven't been able to really catch up with their finances. So it sounds like as long as you can attest to it, and you have to check that box, and if somebody asks you the question down the road, you can answer it in all honesty. It's worth applying to see if you at least qualify, Christina.
That's true. That's very well stated. Thank you. It's worth a shot.
And once again, this does not need to be paid back. Like I'm not going to be sitting here in a year from now talking to people about how to worry about their taxes if they took this benefit, right?
Correct. It is taxable income to the landlord, of course, but it's not to the tenant. So
okay,
you do not need to pay it back.
That's a great point, Christina. Thank you for clarifying that. It obviously, because the landlord is still receiving that rent, it really doesn't change a whole lot for the landlord. They're still getting paid. It just doesn't really, it's a different person paying.
Yeah. And given the current market with the high rents, we really do want to try and keep people in their apartments as much as possible. It's difficult. The vacancy rates are astronomically low. So as many people as we can keep with roofs over their head, the better for all of us community-wide.
Before we go, let's just give each of you 30 seconds for some final thoughts. Paul Smith of the Apartment Association, why don't we start with you?
Well, everyone knows somebody who could qualify for this money and hasn't taken it yet. So go out there, talk to them about it. Tell them how it's free money. It doesn't have to be paid back. They've suffered during COVID, and there's no reason that they have to continue suffering with this great benefit out there. If the state of Utah doesn't use this money, we have to give it back to the feds. So it's not, we're just going to waste it if you don't take it.
Christina?
Yeah, I would just echo what Paul says. A lot of stories we've heard secondhand are individuals are nervous to take this money. They don't want a handout. They don't want to get assistance of any kind. And I just want to reiterate, this is not a handout. Working individuals in our community are paying astronomical amounts for rent. Please take advantage of this so that you can help yourself and your household increase your expendable income, your savings, whatever it may be. This is a short-term program. It's not here for the long haul. So if you're eligible, get in here, apply, get the assistance, and help your household out.
If someone did apply and maybe got denied, is it worth reapplying again?
Absolutely. Yeah, there are a number of reasons why a denial can happen. Perhaps you don't answer your emails or your telephone. We do have a time frame that will deny the application. We can't keep thousands of them open. So reapply if necessary, and make sure that you have your paperwork ready this time. So that's been the biggest holdup after a certain period of time. Make sure you have your paperwork in line, and of course, always welcome to reapply.
And just a final thought or a reminder, where can people apply if they missed the first part of our Facebook Live here?
Sure. And then I'd ask Paul to provide his website as well, because they have some great resources. But rentrelief.utah.gov is the actual portal to apply. That's both for landlords and for tenants. And Paul?
The Apartment Association's website is www.uaahq, like Utah Apartment Association Headquarters, .org. And we have under our resources tab a link to COVID-19 info, and there's lots of information on rental assistance there.
Do those look like the right websites?
Yes.
Perfect. All right. Well, Paul Smith, Christina, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate the conversation. And I think, there's a lot of people watching right now that their eyes are probably this big right now, thinking about the opportunities and also taking probably a big relief, a big sigh of relief, because it's been a tough couple of years. And we appreciate you giving us all this information.
Absolutely.
Thank you.